you allowed to eat jelly donuts, Private Pie?
Sir, no, sir!
These are 10 foods that World War II soldiers actually ate. You can't imagine some of the things they had to eat just to get by.
Eat your eyes for jujubes.
Creamed dried beef.
I've changed his diet to only dry food, and he's no longer allowed on any of the furniture.
This first item would actually have been considered something of a delicacy among World War II soldiers, although you wouldn't know it by the name. It's referred to as creamed dried beef by the U.S. War Department, although soldiers had a number of loving nicknames for this recipe, things like shit on a shingle or same old slop for the less vulgar. In either case, it could be abbreviated down to SOS, a cheeky play on the term save our souls. This is the sort of food that you'd find being served out of the field kitchen, a type of kitchen that was able to travel with the American military and set up within a matter of minutes to begin serving food. The field kitchen was a great option to make sure that soldiers could get a warm meal, and it would also be the kitchen's duty to make sure that each soldier was supplied with the appropriate amount of rations for their day. More on that in a little bit, but first, what exactly is SOS? Well, this delicious little treat was made using a makeshift white gravy combined with chipped beef, a type of beef that was said to be so salty that you'd needed to scald it in boiling water before it could even be considered edible.
That's a little salty.
The white gravy and chipped beef mixture would then be served over toast, making for a not quite edible-looking meal. But don't worry, after we go over some of the other options on this list, that same old slop is going to start looking delicious.
Try it. You're gonna love it.
C-Rations.
Standard rations.
C-Rations were what were given to the American troops to eat while they were in combat conditions. They would come with 6 containers to 1 crate, and each crate was meant to provide soldiers with 3 meals throughout the day. Near the beginning of the war, meal options from these C-Rations would be pretty limited, ranging only between different types of canned stew. As the war went on, however, they were able to find ways to begin including new things into the soldiers' C-Rations. You could suddenly find things like canned spaghetti or pork and beans in there, as well as powdered drinks and instant coffee. Everything was made to be eaten either hot or cold, although it apparently tasted better if you were able to heat things up. We're sure this new menu came as something of a relief to any soldier who was beginning to grow tired of stew, but that relief was probably short-lived considering just how long the American troops would have to live off of C-Rations. These boxes weren't meant to be the only thing a soldier had to eat, but that didn't stop them from being their only option for days and days on end sometimes.
If you close your eyes, it almost feels like you're eating ready eggs.
You know, a bowl of snot.
Because of that, these meals could get a little repetitive. Things like candy, chocolate, or gum would be included with their C-Rations as a morale booster, and we're sure they needed it. With about 3,700 calories worth of food per day packed inside it, each C-Rations crate could grow heavy and would become a little troublesome to carry around with you if you were a paratrooper or a messenger. And so for those sorts of missions, the American Army developed something else.
You idiot. Start over.
K-Rations.
Double the food rations, Mr. Tweedy.
K-Rations were what you would have gotten if you were trying to pack light. Designed for messengers or paratroopers, these were less bulky and easier to carry around, but what you gained in portability, you lost out on big time when it came to calories or taste. K-Rations provided only about 2,800 calories compared to the C-Rations' 3,700, and the kind of food it was filled with wasn't necessarily the kind of food you'd want to eat. It was a lot of biscuits and cheese, then maybe a canned meat for some protein. Things like gum and candy bars would also be included, along with some things that just might have been useful to have on hand, like toilet paper and cutlery made of wood. These boxes were pretty remarkable in and of themselves. Each box that was meant to store food was waterproof, meaning that they made for perfect options for soldiers to carry other items in them when they were in the field, things like matches, letters, and even photographs. But handy as the containers may have been, the food itself was practically inedible to many soldiers.
Are you kidding me? I can't eat that crap.
and they were hardly filling enough to get them through the day. Part of the soldiers' complaints had to do with the fact that K-Rations were meant to last a soldier no longer than 5 days. And yet there would be stories of soldiers needing to survive for several weeks at a time eating nothing but K-Rations. It's no wonder these soldiers would start to think fondly of things like creamed dried beef. But even K-Rations are far from the worst things soldiers had to eat.
And that's not even the worst.
First time here? Well then, welcome. Now go ahead and hit that subscribe button and never miss out. Thanks, you're the best. Egg biscuits.
You gotta risk it to get the biscuit.
We know what you're imagining when we say egg biscuits, something warm, light, and fluffy. But these aren't the sort of egg biscuits that you know. No, instead, this was the name that was given to a type of military ration bread that was distributed among British troops during World War II, and it was mainly relied on while soldiers were working in the field. Egg biscuits were also a bit more like a cookie than they were a cracker, seeing as they were pretty much only made using flour and water. Things like leaven, eggs, sugar, or butter might be included in the mix, if only sparingly. You see, as resources to the British began tightening up over the course of the war, those were the sorts of ingredients that would have started to be rationed and used sparingly. Really, these egg biscuits may as well have just been hardtack, which, interestingly enough, was something that the American troops were eating during World War II, if in name only. Even the hardtack the American troops were eating at the time sounded like they were probably better than the British Army's egg biscuits, as the Americans were eating biscuits made out of soybeans, wheat, egg, and lard. These hardtack biscuits still weren't very popular among those who had to eat them, but at least they were made using more than 2 ingredients.
At least we tried.
Stinging nettle soup.
What?
Do you know what a stinging nettle is? It's a weed, sort of like poison ivy, in the sense that it causes a skin rash if you touch it. Stinging nettle grows all over Europe, and although soldiers hate it for how much it would become a problem in the field, they also can't deny that it got them through a few tough spots. You see, there would be times during World War II that the soldiers would start to wish they had the comforts of a K-ration box or egg biscuit, and during these times, they would have no other choice than to look around and start trying to find food in the wild around them. Sometimes soldiers would luck out and find a group of locals who would be willing to feed them, but other times they had no choice but to make stinging nettle soup. You see, once you boil down or otherwise cook stinging nettle, then the poison that causes a rash is destroyed, and what you're left with is an extremely nutritious vegetable that's full of protein, iron, potassium, manganese, calcium, and even vitamins A and C. Plus, stinging nettle is said to taste like spinach, and whether that's a good thing or not is up to you. Soldiers would collect up the stinging nettle, as well as any other edible greens that they could find in the environment around them, like dandelions or birch bark, all to be added to a stew. If you had them on hand, then stews could also be thickened with a bit of hardtack or egg biscuit. When it comes to food in wartime, sometimes you gotta get creative.
Okay, now you're getting creative.
Bully beef risole. Bully beef was pretty much universally hated among the British troops. It wasn't always on the menu, but when it was, that was usually a sign that the kitchen battalion was under attack or that wartime conditions had slowed down their food delivery or something.
We're firing! 76 beefs, 34 chickens, okay?
Bully beef was pretty much only eaten in emergency situations, is what we're saying. It was canned corned beef, and although it provided soldiers with their much-needed protein, it was required to be eaten far too many times throughout the course of the war. There would be several days at a time where the only things that British soldiers had to eat would be bully beef and egg biscuits, which definitely gets a bit boring after a while. And so, to try and make their repetitive meals a little bit easier to eat, the British troops came up with bully beef risole, which was just enough of an improvement to keep them from losing their appetites altogether. Soldiers would crush up their biscuits, then mash it all in with the corned beef before adding in whatever vegetables they had on hand. Onions were apparently popular at the time, but scavenging up whatever field greens were nearby would work too. The meat and biscuit mixture would then get flattened down into a patty that's roughly the size of a burger.
I'll make you a very good, very traditional cheeseburger.
I don't think you can.
And the whole thing would be fried in the fat from the beef. Still, we imagine that the troops would have missed the variety of a ration pack by that point. Allies ration pack.
Travel biscuits from the ration packs.
We've discussed what went into the ration packs of the American Army, but just how different were the ration packs of other countries? Well, believe it or not, there were quite a few differences. The British distributed their rations out in something called 24-hour ration packs, or 14-man rations. These would often be centered around a tin of some kind of protein, like Spam or steak and kidney pudding, but you would also get things like beans, sausages, soup, and powdered milk for use in tea. The Canadian Army was often provided with a tin of corned beef and a can of sardines, as well as hardtack that was so tough that it needed to be softened in their tea before it could be eaten. But fortunately, whether you were serving with the American, the British, or the Canadian Army, all three of these countries provided their troops with just a bit of chocolate to help boost energy and morale.
Gave us an energy boost.
Wassersuppe. There were plenty of rumors surrounding what the German army had been feeding their soldiers during World War II. Some believed that the Germans had stumbled upon a Superman vitamin pill, something that later turned out to be something known as Pervitin, which contains methamphetamine that would provide the soldiers with a short burst of energy, but it was far from a miracle pill.
Not a miracle.
When it came to nutrition, a lot of the German army's diet consisted of soups and stews, although what was in that mix sort of depended on the point of the war you're talking about. In the beginning, their stews were said to be so thick with meat that you can make a spoon stand up straight in the bowl. But as the war raged on, resources began to grow thin, and the cooks began to grow desperate for something to put in the mix. At this point, a lot of their soups began to be made by boiling the bones of an animal. Crushed bread could be used to bulk the soup out a little bit, and they would throw in a few field greens, like stinging nettles, for a little more nutrition. Turnip bread. Think you could live without bread?
No, God!
As you can see from this list, bread was clearly a staple for soldiers throughout the war, even if that bread was made out of nothing but flour and water. But as we've also seen, resources grew scarce over time. So what do you do if you can't even get the wheat to make flour? Well, you improvise, of course. Just about any vegetable you can think of was ground to make a flour out of at some point in time. But the most popular option by far was turnip bread. It's hard to imagine that turnip bread tasted anything like the real deal, but at least combining its flour with water would still work to make egg biscuits. And believe it or not, turnip wasn't even the only vegetable that was being turned into bread during World War II.
And I love bread.
Rzhevsky bread. Moving on over to the Soviet Army, they had a recipe for bread that was completely unique. Starting with just a potato, you would have to boil it, remove its skin, and then put the whole thing through a meat grinder. The mashed up potato would then be spread thin over a board and sprinkled with bran before being left to cool. Then more bran would be added along with salt, and the whole mixture would then be kneaded and placed into greased tins to be baked in the oven. That's pretty much about as simple as bread can get, but fortunately they didn't have to work with just that the entire time. In the spring of 1944, the Soviet armies received a shipment of cornmeal from the Allies. And for those in the kitchens who knew what to do, it allowed them to make flatbreads for their soldiers. But there were some cases where the cooks just started adding the cornmeal to their potato breads, which would make them more crumbly and stale-tasting. This made the cooks quite unpopular among the soldiers from then on.
Let me see your Indian war cry, son! I don't...
Check out more great videos. Just tap or click. Hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell.